Biology 11, 17.2, Earth's early history. Well, this can be fairly lengthy. I'm going to try to find a few efficiencies in this lecture, but what we're talking about is how things came to form on the Earth, and there's a fair number of hypotheses we'll go through here that lead into a few theories. No time like the present. We'll get going. Now, earlier in class, we had talked about the formation of the Earth. Interestingly enough, if we really want to go back far enough, let's go back to the theory of the Big Bang. Now, this comes up in physics a little bit more often than it does in a biology course. But the Big Bang is the idea that everything in the universe originated from a giant singularity of mass. What does that mean? Well, let's see if we can avoid the images of the TV show. But this is, it's a tough one to get away from. So I will choose this. The idea that the entire universe began some 13, perhaps even 15 million years ago from a giant singularity of mass that became so unstable that it exploded and radiated more or less kind of out in all directions, and that galaxies and the items therein are still expanding as if hurtled by this incredible interstellar force. Now, interestingly enough, when we look at our universe, a lot of things are still migrating outwards in space. They're moving away from us. And one of the ways of telling that is things that are moving away have what we call a redshift. And we see a lot of that going on in our universe, and it sort of makes us think, well, why are things moving away? What is with that redshift? The idea that, well, if a lot of things are moving away, what would be the singular force that might have been responsible for that? Now, I'll leave this discussion to the physicists, but the idea is that around 14 billion years ago, the Big Bang happened, and that the universe formed from everything that was cast outwards and had more or less settled and created everything we're looking at, and more. The Earth, based on our chemical analyses of rock using radiocarbon dating, etc., our estimate is around 4.3 billion years old, and that's fairly solid data. Now, it's hard, if you're going to talk about geological timescales like that, to look at a crushing amount of evidence. It's very hard to say, especially when the origin of life began on our planet, because you have to look for not just direct evidence, but trace evidence. Now, interestingly enough, the Earth itself was part of sort of like a cosmic game of pool going on, and there was, especially in our solar system, there were large planetoids, huge masses crashing into each other. And really what you're looking at now is kind of like the last man standing, as far as the Earth goes, and our 9 planets, 8 and a dwarf planet that we call Pluto, and whatever they've decided has gone past that. What remained set stable orbits around our star, the Sun, and what was pulverized, many of those items ended up being the demarker between the inner and outer planets, which we call the asteroid belt. We've been hit by things many, many a time. Even our moon is squished on one side, and we believe that it not only hit us, but could have been the colossal reset button for the evolution of life on our planet. Because if life had been evolving and we got hit by something the size of our moon, it would have been a complete reset. Interestingly enough, if we look at the periodic table, we find trends. I always say, remember, carbon in our universe will do its best to form bonds. Now, this is an ionic example, but carbon will do everything it can to share 4 electrons to fill up its outer shell. Just basic chemistry. That's what it will do. Looking at CH4 or methane, we see certain periodic trends. and the elements will just do these things. It makes them chemically stable. It shows us that there's rules in the periodic table, and that as things formed on our planet, well, we were looking at the rules of chemistry unfolding with various levels of energy inputs and lack of energy. You get the idea. Our atmosphere would not be what you'd see today. Our oxygenated atmosphere, our lovely blue planet, owes its heritage to what the plants and the aerobic, photosynthetic bacteria have been spewing into the atmosphere, being oxygen. We're a lovely blue from space for that very reason. But at the time of the formation of the Earth, we would have been more Hadean, very nasty. Acid rain, lots of sulfur in the atmosphere coming down, water. Now, once we'd cooled, water would have been able to form a liquid on this M-class planet of ours. By M-class, we are the kind of planet that's far enough away from a star to be frozen, but not too frozen. We have water in a liquid form. And to be warm, but not so warm as the water is always in a gaseous state, unavailable. We're in what we call a cosmic sort of sweet spot. And water exists on our planet in copious quantities in its liquid form, which is prime for the support of life. Hydrogen cyanide, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide. It was a toxic ball of gas when we first began. It took, remarkably, if we say it was about 4.5 billion years, it took a very long time, about 500 million years if you want to think about it that way, for the Earth to cool down just enough for water to pool on its surface, form our oceans. And we don't just think that it was the resident water. We know that we were hit by very large cosmic objects, and some of those objects were comets, for example. We've been hit by so many things that a comet is a dirty snowball traveling through space. If we got hit by a colossal one of those, it would have added to our water content on Earth. The first organic molecules, well, I look at something like methane and I say, well, it's hard to say methane is not an organic molecule. It's produced as a byproduct of biological critters on our planet. You look at cows chewing on grass, and as the cellulose is digested in their ruminant stomachs, there's a tremendous methane production. When you look at cellulose consumption, wood is a very good example of this. When it's consumed by termites, tremendous methane consumption. There's a lot of organic molecules that we're composed of that could have formed on the Earth and that we would have needed to get going. Organic molecules such as, well, you could look at amino acids that make up proteins. You could look at hydrocarbons that eventually led to the formation of our first simple sugars and our carbohydrates. Along these lines, in the 50s, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, they came up with an idea. They thought, is it possible to simulate the early conditions on Earth and sort of set up a chemistry experiment and see, is it possible that organic compounds could have formed given enough time and enough energy and the rules of the periodic table? It's very important to remember the early Earth was extremely energetic, highly ionized atmosphere, incredible amounts of heat. Energy is the ability to do work, and if energy is the ability to do work, then we could have formed some fairly impressive chemical bonds. Urey Miller's experiment is a very famous one. What did it show? They were able to do kind of an interesting little in-lab experiment. They set up a heat source, which is represented by this Bunsen burner. So I'll just do a quick little tour here. This Bunsen burner here, this heat source, represented heat energy if you will, in the early Earth's atmosphere. There was a lot of water on the planet, in liquid form. And as it was heated, they looked at what they could do to not only heat water, but to introduce some simple chemical compounds. It's like saying, let's take carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Oh, not in that position, rather. Let's input them over here. Let's be correct in our order. Let's supply all the gases of the atmosphere: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And if we give them a source of energy here, and we simulate the highly ionized atmosphere of Earth at the time. By ionized, if you were outside and your hair was standing on end, static electricity, like you put your hands on a Van de Graaff generator, you have to understand there were lightning strikes. The air was full of charge, and it supplied a form of energy that could have, in concert with heat energy, being used by elements and larger combinations of elements that we refer to as molecules to come together into certain combinations. Now, in the Urey Miller experiment, by adding this primitive mixture of gases and supplying energy at this point here and at this point here, what they found in the collection chamber, this Erlenmeyer flask at the bottom, was amino acids. Now, amino acids are the precursors, or they lead to the creation of protein. So when you consume a steak, your body breaks down the proteins in the opposite direction to create amino acids. If you work out at the gym, those amino acids are synthesized into new muscle tissue, for example, building up large biceps and pectorals and things like that. They were able to produce not just amino acids, but other organic compounds. This is a tremendous experiment because it shows that inorganic material, given a reaction chamber and energy, could produce organic compounds. We're composed of organic compounds. Interestingly enough, this isn't the origin of life, but it is the origin of what life would have needed. And that's the prevailing wisdom and what you would take away from the Urey Miller experiment. It's not the formation of life, it's the formation of organic compounds. Interestingly enough, our average body is made up of about, well, between $12 and $15 worth of chemical elements. And those simple chemical elements compose our organic essence, and we are alive. We're living chemistry, if you will. Not to say it wasn't a controversial idea, because this idea is always associated with the idea that, well, that life came from non-life. Well, that's not what it says. There's still a long distance between organic compounds, organic chemistry, and life, but it is a very strong connection. If we go back and we look at Earth's origin, and we say, well, according to our scientific estimates, between 200 and 300 million years ago, say after the Earth had water, we do see evidence of bacterial cells. One of the interesting things that we do find is we find these mats that we call stromatolites. They're interesting. We find them in Australia and other areas of the world. They are collections of blue-green algae that form almost a mushroom-like mound that we call a stromatolite. You can see them here. And these layers of bacteria grow on top of each other until you get a large sort of dome. And we found fossilized evidence of these to suggest that they've been around for an extremely long time. Here they are underwater, and they build up. I heard an interesting analogy saying that looking at the size of the bacteria, the size of the stromatolite in comparison is like well over a 1 to 200 story building. Just a tremendous size compared to the bacteria. And they make these kind of wavy shapes. Now, these are growth patterns, and they're growth patterns where the bacteria, they're migrating up towards the light, and they're forming a new layer each year because the sediment will kill them off. So they keep growing upwards and upwards and upwards each year. And the stromatolites, you got to be careful. These are quite slick. You would never walk on these. But this is a little piece of evidence that shows that on our planet, things like cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, etc., have been around for a very long time, and these are the kind of critters that were responsible for populating our early atmosphere with that precious gas oxygen that was required for animals to really take over. So just go back here for a second. Modern bacteria show up about the time the Earth gets liquid water, right? Everybody thinks that plants were the first photosynthesizers, and that's not true. The cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae, they invented it first. Another interesting point, and I'll jump out to my laptop here for a second on this one, is that they talk about these protenoid microspheres, and I thought this was interesting that the author raised this in the book. What they're talking about here is membranes, so I'm going to highlight that. Now, membranes themselves are made up of a compound that we call lipids, and that's a tough one because it doesn't really, in British Columbia, come up until you discuss it at length, lipids, in Biology 12. Lipids are fats, oils, or waxes. Now, when we look at membranes, I've got something to show you here. Just pop out of reflection for a moment, because I can't do everything in reflection. If you've ever added oil to water, you've seen that the two don't mix. Now, that's because water is polar and oil itself is not. Let's pop out to the site here. Just get to it. Here we go. There we are. And, here it is. When you look at what we call a lipid bilayer, this is what your cell's composed of. Without getting too much into the molecular structure, it's a kind of structure where one side is okay with water, and these little green bits are not. They're kind of like oil. They'll point in towards the center. When you look at something like a lipid, it will wall itself off from water in a very effective way. A neat one called phospholipids turns out to be responsible for the membranes of your cells. So if you think about water being on the outside here, what the layer will try to do is it'll try to and essentially kind of wall itself off from water, line up in a way where they're really not having much to do with each other. This is what I wanted to show you. These are called liposomes. And liposomes are when a lipid layer will form a membrane. And it will form a membrane in a way where it keeps the watery world outside and sort of keeps the inner goodness. Now we see this come up in the idea of of a cell. It keeps the cellular material on the inside. It's sort of like bagging itself off from the environment and walling something in. Now, when we get to grade 12, we'll talk a lot more about phospholipids, but what they do is they create a baggie. And inside of that baggie, this structure gives you a hint. If we put organic material on the inside, say something like nucleic acids, and some famous ones are DNA and RNA, maybe what we've done is created a bag for genetic material. And because we see liposomes form in nature, we're convinced that these little organic baggies can put themselves together. Liposomes. And these are interesting little things. You can use these to deliver drugs across cells. So I'll show you this just for fun. They'll literally merge with your cell membrane, and what's inside of them will go across. Interesting sort of little side note. I'm going to pop back out to reflection for a minute. and finish the rest of what we were going over. The point is, Urey Miller indicated that organic compounds could have spontaneously formed in the early atmosphere, and the formation of these microspheres, and I like to talk about them in terms of just membranes, is another indication that not only could have organics formed, but membranes could have formed as well, which led to the eventual creation of the first cells. That's sort of how the hypothesis goes. They call them protenoid microspheres because not only were they able to form these little membranes, but little chunks of proteins, just like our cellular membranes, will spontaneously form. There's a case for this. If you get a chance later on, ask your chemistry teacher what bubbles have to do with membranes. Just use the word micelle and just see where it goes. It's very interesting. So maybe those spheres acquired more characteristics of living things. Maybe they took on, those little spheres, formed a bilayer, and then inside, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but maybe we got genetic material like DNA enclosed inside. And one of the interesting things about DNA is that's a self-replicating molecule of the class we call nucleic acids. Nucleic acids assemble according to a set of very predictable rules. And I'll see you in Biology 12 where we go over that ad nauseum. It's a wonderful topic. Now, the evolution of DNA and RNA are kind of interesting. DNA and RNA, I like to explain them when I first talk to students as if they're cousins. They're genetic material. And we know that nucleic acids, ribonucleic for RNA and deoxyribonucleic for DNA, can replicate under the right conditions. So it is possible that these self-replicating molecules became the code of life. And if you follow modern sort of computer topics, there's a lot of excitement around DNA and RNA, nucleic acids, because of the potential they offer to the computing world for all the possible combinations you could make to help save all the data on our planet. Because you can hold a tremendous amount of material in DNA. When you look at the human genetic code, it is unbelievable what is stored in our cells. Something as small as 10 micrometers in diameter. Incredible. RNA, being an older cousin, even precedes DNA. So we think